Welcome back to Space Talks. Today's gonna be a little bit different video. In most of my videos, I talk about legal and policy matters, politics, what have you. Today, what I'm going to do is probably going to be a little bit more technically oriented, and I say technically oriented with with quotes because I am not a I'm not really an expert in engineering or orbital mechanics or what have you. But this is going to be a rudimentary discussion of what we call fractional orbital bombardment systems. And this is relevant because back on September 20th, at the Air Force Association meeting, Secretary of the Air Force, Kendall, basically came right out and said that the Chinese, the PRC, tested a hypersonic weapon in outer space that had the characteristics of what we call a fractional orbital bombardment system. Now, this came out again in the Financial Times last Sunday, I believe. But the first one to come out was with Breaking Defense, and I'm actually going to leave a link to the Breaking Defense article in the description here so you can go and read it. But this really caught my eye because the whole idea of fractional bombardment is like, wow, this is a concept that really hasn't been deployed for decades now, for over 30 years now, with the Soviet Union basically deploying the first system back in the late 60s into the mid 80s. So this really, again, caught my eye. But the idea is this concept of FOBs that the PRC reportedly tested didn't use a standard, isn't a standard, what I call a standard FOB in a sense, because it uses a hypersonic glide vehicle that could potentially carry a nuclear weapon. So a lot of interesting implications, both from a legal and a policy standpoint. I'm not going to go too much into that. I'll talk a little bit about the end, but I did write a special issue of my briefing letter that came out on the 20th of this month, and I'm going to leave a link to the website if you want to subscribe to my newsletter. But otherwise, I'm really not going to go into detail into the analysis of the policy and the legal end of it, just because, well, I just did that last Wednesday, and it is premium material, and my subscribers should have the benefit of that first. So again, I'll give you the opportunity at the end here to go to the website to subscribe to my briefing letter if you want to. So this whole idea of FOBs, fractional orbital bombardment, has been around again since the 60s. It's something the U.S. toyed with and said, well, we're not really interested because it really has some drawbacks to it, and it really isn't worth the expenditure versus regular ICBMs. But the Soviets started testing and deploying the system. In fact, they tested it and they ran tests and deployed it right after not long after they signed the Outer Space Treaty, which has some interesting legal implications, which I'll briefly talk about at the end of this video. So what this video is going to do is give you a very rough description of what fractional orbital bombardment is all like. Because throw the fancy terms around, it's another thing to understand it. Now, yes, I'm not an expert in orbital dynamics or I'm an engineer, but as an attorney, you have to, in order to look at something from a policy and a legal standpoint, you've really got to have a rudimentary understanding of these topics. So I educated myself, so I understand a little bit about fractional orbital bombardment. Now, the Johnson administration dealt with this back in the 60s, and it was during the Johnson administration that the Outer Space Treaty came into existence. And there were some excellent declassified documents on this at the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library. And what I did is I went in and read some of those documents, wanted to write my briefing letter, but I also took some of the illustrations that I'm going to use here in this video to explain the concept of fractional orbital bombardment systems, just to give you an idea of what's going on and then kind of educate you in a sense. And again, of course, this is the whole caveat, this isn't legal advice, this is just for informational purposes only. Fractional orbital bombardment system, FOBs, and I'll keep on referring it to as FOBs as we go through this. The whole idea of nuclear weaponry, intercontinental nuclear weaponry, is you have an ICBM, which is basically a rocket booster with the warhead. Now it could be either single warhead or multiple warheads. Although with the new treaty, with the treaties from the START treaty, START treaty requirements, basically a lot of the Minuteman missiles used to be MIRVs, multiple warheads. Now they're down to just one, just to comply with the START treaty. But in the case there were, a lot of these missiles have multiple warheads, and basically they go up on a ballistic trajectory and they come back down. They don't go into orbit like you would put a satellite or a spacecraft. So let's go to that. So here's a description. Here's basically an illustration of a typical ICBM trajectory. And of course, the altitude is exaggerated just because of scaling and such. But what it shows is the launch point, and the rocket, the booster boosts the warhead and its bus, what we call the warhead bus, into a ballistic trajectory about 500 to 800 miles. It never goes into an orbit like you would say with a satellite or a spacecraft. At the peak, at the apogee of that ballistic arc, it starts to descend on its target and makes those adjustments to basically fall right onto its target and detonate. That's typical ICBM, very simplified ICBM trajectory. And of course, missile defense nowadays, ground-based missile defense, the whole idea is to intercept that RV as it's coming down off from that ballistic track. And because of the predictability of the ballistic track, and because these things have limited maneuvering capabilities, missile defense is able to hone in on the RVs themselves and actually destroy them before they have a chance to detonate. So I'm going to talk about that in respects to the Chinese FOBs that was tested in a little bit later. Fractional orbital bombardment is a little bit different because instead of going up at that ballistic trajectory, the booster actually launches the vehicle, the warhead, and its bus, and some other things into a fraction of an orbit. In other words, it'd be the same idea of putting a satellite in orbit or a space capsule in orbit, except this one is basically a warhead with a guidance system and an additional rocket engine. And I'll have you a rough illustration a little bit later to show you the difference between an ICBM and a FOBS rocket. Once that warhead is in a fraction of the orbit, when it gets to the point where it's going to actually start falling on its target, it deboosts. It basically fires a retro rocket that basically breaks it out of orbit so it can fall on its target. Now, again, you got to look at just basically comparing the altitudes. A typical ICBM will go 500 to 800. The FOB system will only go to about 100 kilometers. And I guess this was also the case with the Chinese hypersonic FOBs test that we're talking about today. But notice that in this case, the trajectory is north to south. Now, as we'll see next time, the FOBs can also inject into basically a southerly target over the southern pole. And this was important and kind of concerning back during the 60s and 70s because the radar line that the U.S. had set up basically was set mostly for the north. Any incoming ICBMs would come off on a ballistic trajectory from the north. There was very little radar coverage from the south, so the idea was the FOBs would come in very, very low over the horizon in this low orbit, in this partial orbit, and then fall onto a target. And this is very concerning, and this kind of makes it a little bit difficult for missile defense because once it's fallen out of orbit, it's kind of the path is a lot more shallow than say a ballistic trajectory would for a normal MIRV. But it also, which would make it a little bit more difficult for a ground-based missile defense to home in on it. And there's actually some nuances to hypersonic glide vehicles that we'll talk about a little bit that actually create more problems. So the whole idea with this right here is this whole idea of FOBs was a concern from the respect. Okay, we really don't have a defense, even though we had nuclear tipped ABMs developed at that time. An ABM system, because of the nature of the orbit, because of the nature that the reentry vehicle comes in, makes it a lot difficult for an ABM to do it. In fact, the way they dealt with that was they turned around and said, okay, we're going to mobilize an ASAT, a nuclear tipped anti-satellite weapon, which they did, which was based on a Thor rocket and based on Johnston Island. And the idea is the rocket would launch, and while the vehicle was still in its partial orbit before it's deboosted, the Thor rocket would go up. The nuclear warhead would detonate in proximity of that delivery vehicle, and basically the neutron flux and the EMP would fry the guidance system on it, which would basically make it useless. It wasn't an outright direct kill, but it was basically a kill from afar by actually killing the guidance system. And a lot of these effects they learned during the Starfish Prime nuclear test. Now I know there's some issues with a lot of people thinking, well, Outer Space Treaty, You know, it's not that a nuclear explosion or operating a nuclear weapon isn't legal. Well, that isn't completely accurate. And I'm really not going to go into this video because, like I said, I really go into that in my briefing letter, and that's premium content right now for subscribers. This is kind of a little bit a better diagram of, and very simplified diagram of how the FOB works. It launches, it goes in a 100-mile altitude orbit. It starts turning, getting ready to boost out to basically fire a retro rocket to go. In other words, it's going this way, so it's got to turn this way, base its rocket the other way, fire its rocket engine, and then fall down into that very, very shallow trajectory onto its target. So and the whole idea is that FOBs can basically be deboosted at any point in that 100-mile orbit. It's basically okay if you calculate how long it's going to take, program into the guidance system so that it knows when to fire the retro rocket to deboost it out of orbit. Again, very interesting system, and but it does have some drawbacks, which we'll go into in a bit. This is kind of a rough example of a side-by-side diagram of a ICBM system with a reentry vehicle and a FOB system. Now, really, the first stages of both are the same. Basically, they're going to use the same type of rocket and some sort of intercontinental ballistic missile. But the difference is the ICBM will boost the warhead and its reentry vehicle and the guidance system into a ballistic orbit. And again, then it'll go up to 300, to 500, to 800, then come down on a ballistic trajectory. It basically, but on the other hand, on the FOB system, you have a little bit more, it's a little bit more complicated because you don't just have a warhead and a reentry vehicle and a guidance system like you and ICBM. You have a warhead, a reentry vehicle, fuel tanks, and an engine, and a guidance system. So you have the addition of the fuel tanks and the engine to basically deorbit the vehicle while it's in that 100-mile fractional orbit. And that costs weight. That's a weight penalty. And all this is about weight. You only have a certain amount of energy in a missile, in a rocket body, to boost it. So if you're going to use a FOB system, you're going to have to lose weight somewhere in the third stage, and that's going to have to be with the warhead. You're going to have to use a smaller warhead. In other words, while an ICBM you could use a larger warhead because you don't have the excess fuel and engine to contend with. In a FOB system, you do have the fuel and the engine to contend with, plus everything else that you need. So it's going to have to be a smaller warhead in order to make up the weight. So that's one of the problems with it. Another issue with it is accuracy. This FOB system that the Soviets deployed was really theoretically not as accurate as a MIRV system. In other words, you're coming in at a very, very shallow orbit, and after it drops out of orbit, just like a MIRV or on an ICBM, you really don't have that much maneuverability once you've fallen out of orbit. So your accuracy is going to be kind of sketchy at best. And again, you have a smaller warhead, so the effectiveness of the FOB system was brought into question. Again, this was never, obviously we didn't have a nuclear war, so this was never really deployed, never really tested in real life. But in theory, this is one of the reasons why the U.S. didn't really develop the system, their own FOB system, and why they weren't really super concerned about it, even though they did deploy an ASAT to contend with it. So I think this is a very interesting illustration. Again, you can go to the Johnson Presidential Library and look through the digital files as well and see this all for yourself, as well as some really other interesting documents as well. This is a picture of an actual Soviet FOB system, and it's really interesting because but the interesting thing about Soviet rocket design early on is you can see the separate stages. You can see the first stage, the main stage, the second stage, and the third stage. Now, the third stage, you notice, is a lot bigger than you would normally see on an ICBM, because of the simple fact is, in addition to the warhead and the guidance system and the bus, you also had an engine. You also had an engine and the fuel for the engine in order to break it out of orbit. So this thing was a lot bigger on the third stage. Again, that extra weight penalty, which means you had to have a smaller warhead. And again, I gave photo credit to where I actually took this. So very, very interesting system. Now, the Soviets basically tested this right up, starting in the early 60s. They performed another test maybe a few months after the Outer Space Treaty was signed. And this is what kind of brought, really brought the idea to, this is really important. We got to start talking about this because we just signed this thing called the Outer Space Treaty. And of course, this thing in practice would have a nuclear weapon on it. And, there was discussions about legalities and such. But ultimately, they deployed, I believe, 18 of these, and they started deploying them in the late 60s. And between 1982 and 1983, they actually stood down all 18 of them as part. And these things were actually addressed in the SALT II agreement, but SALT II was never really ratified. But the Soviets got rid of them anyways, because I think it was more out of convenience, because submarine-launched ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles were better developed at that time and could probably do the job better than a FOB system. And of course, these things, they had these things sitting around. Well, you can use these as basically cannon fodder in any arms control negotiation. So basically, like I said, this Soviet system was eventually retired and dismantled. But the whole thing with the IBM system, this technology using kind of the ICBM technology and just dropping out of orbit with an RV, wasn't very accurate. It didn't have a lot of accuracy, and of course, you had that smaller warhead. So really, the effectiveness of it in actual practice would have been brought into question. This brings in the whole thing with what the Chinese have purportedly done with incorporating a hypersonic vehicle into the FOBs idea. In other words, they've taken the idea of FOBs, fractional orbital bombardment, but they've added a hypersonic glide vehicle that may have a nuclear capability to carry a nuclear warhead. The interesting and kind of concerning thing about hypersonic weapons, hypersonic glide vehicles, is they're very maneuverable. And they can, once they start descending back into the atmosphere, not only are they coming in screaming, but they can actually maneuver and avoid, which basically makes them harder to hit with current anti-ballistic missile ground technology. In other words, the systems we have for ballistic missile defense right now, even though they'd be effective on an RV coming in off of a ballistic trajectory, they probably would not be as effective with an RV that's coming in very, very shallow. Remember, these things are only going to be up about 100 in an orbit that's about 100 miles in altitude before they drop out of orbit. They're going to be coming in very, very shallow and very, very fast. And oh, by the way, they can maneuver, and the guidance systems on an ABM may have a very hard time locking into them and destroying them. So the idea of accuracy, well, now again, purportedly, this test missed its target by 24 miles. This is just a test. And with computer technology today, they're probably going to rectify that. And they may eventually deploy this a FOB system is based on a hypersonic, with a hypersonic glide vehicle and a nuclear warhead. Very concerning because, again, there is no real defense from an ABM standpoint to actually do this. I mean, there's some other options which are not very palatable. Now, the whole thing about legality comes in on this because of Article 2 and the Outer Space Treaty, Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, and its treatment of nuclear weapons. In other words, no placement of nuclear weapons or no vehicles carrying nuclear weapons are permitted under Article 4. Now that's just I'm not going to hash through it directly. And I've seen some reactions when this story first came out that, basically, treaty violation, what have you. My opinion, and based on historical documents, based on some of these declassified documents, is the FOB system doesn't violate the Outer Space Treaty, even if it had a nuclear warhead on it. Even though it goes just a fraction of an orbit, even though it is in orbit for a short amount of time, it doesn't, and in space, it doesn't violate the Outer Space Treaty. And it really, there's more complexity to this than I want to go into in this video. And I'm pushing my briefing letter today because like I said, I really researched and wrote very heavily on this and analyzed about this. It does not, the Outer Space Treaty basically isn't in the equation. And if I really explained it, a lot of heads would explode, and I'd probably get a lot of interesting comments. But just suffice to say, FOBs do not violate Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, in my opinion. And I'll stick to that based on the analysis that I've seen and based on policy positions in the past. I mean, you can go do your own research if you want, but that's going to be my point. So why are these concerning? Well, I think bottom line is, and this may sound dramatic, but I think this is the first. I think hypersonics brings the idea of FOBs to full maturity. I mean, because you have a vehicle that not only can go very high speeds when it re-enters, but can also maneuver, and which makes it more accurate and really makes missile defense at the ground level very, very sketchy at best. Even though there are, the people varying opinions about the effect of missile defense. Anyways, not going to go into that here, but it makes it very effective, and I think it makes this what I would call a first strike weapon. In other words, this and this goes back with the whole idea of the PLA's idea of deterrence. The idea of deterrence with the PLA is what we call preemption. In other words, initiating an attack that will basically convince the enemy that, you know what, it's a good idea to stop the conflict and basically, negotiate and stop all hostilities before things get blown off into a big war. And that is really that's the underlying pinning of the idea of deterrence that the PLA follows. So, in essence, hypersonic a fob based on hypersonic technology could be a very effective first strike weapon, in my opinion. I mean, there are various things you could use it to directly attack missile fields and bomber bases, or you could use fobs to actually create this situation what's called pinning, which is actually a theoretical thing where you don't detonate the warhead to destroy a surface target, but you detonate warheads in space above missile fields and bomber bases to create so much EMP and so much thermal energy that ICBMs and bombers cannot get off the ground, and that'll give you an opportunity to use other land-based and sea-based assets to actually destroy the missile field. Although with a capability as accurate as with potential accuracy of a hypersonic glide vehicle and maneuverability, you may be able to preemptively take out missile fields. So this is very destabilizing, and I think puts a whole idea of mutual assured destruction really on shaky footing. Well, in my opinion, the whole doctrine has been shaky from the beginning, but I think the idea of a hypersonic vehicle like this could actually, create some real problems for mutual assured destruction and our idea of deterrence and the ability to say, hey, you hit us, we're going to have enough to come back and hit you afterwards. So I think in that essence, it is what we would call a first strike weapon, even though the PRC and the PLA say has this quote no first strike policy. I'm not going to take their word for it, especially if you're putting something like this in your silo. And of course, the hard thing is, how do you tell what vehicle, what ICBMs are actually have a conventional MIRV, the traditional MIRV warhead on it, or RV on it, or which one is going to be a FOBS. So they made the Chinese have made some pretty spectacular progress with this idea of hypersonics. Marrying it to the idea of FOBs, I think just brings the whole idea of FOBs to fruition, and just really something very concerning. I'm not going to I'm not going to spout a lot of hyperbole and get nationalistic here, but I'm just going to say it is very concerning, and it's something that policymakers and defense strategists are going to have to deal with, because you got to find some sort of either that, or you got to find some sort of countermeasure. It's a very concerning situation. The Pressy, after the Financial Times article came out last week, I decided it was time to write a special issue of my briefing letter on this. And I go into, and basically I attack this from the legal and the policy aspect of it. I talk about Cold War, the FOBs during the Cold War, and how the Johnson administration analyzed the legalities and the policy additions. And I give some of my own ideas on the policy reasons for them doing what they did. Understanding that any legal position that an administration takes is basically a policy decision, and it is basically lawyers saying, "Well, this is the way it should be." It's the policymakers who make the policy saying, "Okay, we're going to take this legal position, and we're going to make it our policy because, well, we're the ones in charge and we're the ones who make policy, not the lawyers." So fundamentally, that's what I did. I wrote this issue, and it went out last Wednesday on the 20th. And I'm going to keep, of course, this is for subscribers. If you want to become a subscriber, www.thepressy.net, go there. You can actually use PayPal to subscribe. If you want to give me a call and use a credit card, I can take a credit card over the phone as well. And I will get you started with a full year subscription of the Pressy, including 4 quarterly issues. Plus, I'll make sure you get this special issue of the Pressy as well, dealing with FOBs, which I think are going to be a very tricky thing for the U.S. to deal with, U.S. and the West to deal with, especially if this type of system is eventually deployed. And there's no reason for me not, I can't think of any reason why they wouldn't, the Chinese wouldn't deploy the system once they work the bugs out of the accuracy part of it. Again, very effective system, very concerning system. And I hope there's something we can come up with actually, at least, counter it or basically deter its use in the future. So again, this is a little bit different than what I normally do from the law and policy thing. But again, I think it's a very important issue, and it's important for my listeners here to understand some of the fundamentals of this idea of FOBs, because there's going to be a lot of people, talking about FOBs who really don't understand what FOB is about. I want you informed to understand, some of the rudimentary principles of of this concept, so that you can, well, obviously, so and you can go into, and knowledge is power, or knowledge is potential power. But anyways, that's all I have for this video. It's a good weekend out. We're heading into winter very soon. I hope you're safe, and please stay well. We'll talk to you next time.